everyone. We're going to get started. Good afternoon. I'm Marya Besharov. I'm Professor of Organizations and Impact here at Said Business School. I'm also the Academic Director of the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you to today's Insights for Action seminar. The seminar series generally explores how researchers and practitioners within Oxford and well beyond Oxford are using research insights for action. Today, we're going to be talking about the role of consultants in the social impact sector. We're going to be thinking about power, about the challenges that arise in the consulting relationship, and also the potential to really have powerful social impact and shape the field. This is a special seminar. It's a co-hosted seminar with the Gradel Institute for Charity, and I want to especially thank Peter Frumpkin and the Institute at New College for the partnership on today's seminar. Thank you so much, Peter. This is also a special seminar because we are co-hosting in honor of Dr. Leah Reisman's book. Leah is a sociologist and a nonprofit leader. Her research generally is on nonprofit organizations and philanthropy, both in the United States, also in Mexico. It's appeared in Stanford Social Innovation Review, in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and in a number of academic journals. And as we see here, in this new book that's coming out from Stanford University Press. Leah serves as a program officer at the Barra Foundation in Philadelphia. She's also a research fellow at John Bradema Center at NYU, and she received her PhD in sociology from Princeton University in 2020. She's the author of the book that we're focusing on today, and the title is How Consultants Shape Nonprofits. We don't have copies for everyone, but you will see on your chairs a flyer with some information about how to get a copy. Leah is joined in conversation with me by two other guests, Ben Taylor. Ben is a sustainability partner for EY based in London. He focuses on delivering climate and sustainability strategies for global corporations. He works mainly in the energy sector, working on the energy transition and delivering on SDG 13. Also has done work in telecoms and technology. And Ben has played a lead role in building out EY's global thought leadership, especially the 4 Futures climate installations at COPs 28, 29, and also COP 16. And he's developed, interestingly, a measure measuring for the impact of global organizational cultures, which I would love to pick up on at some point. Ben is on the advisory board for Responsible Business Institute at the University of Strathclyde and is an advisor to the other university's business school's Masters of Accounting program. You'll forgive me for that.
Thank you.
And finally, Dr. Emma Grant. Emma is a senior technical expert at SDD Direct, specializing in governance and social development. She has over 25 years experience leading projects on safeguarding, security, justice, violence prevention, gender equality, and accountability. And before joining SDD Direct, Emma worked for DFID for 10 years, including 3 years in Ethiopia, working on security and justice reforms and civil society engagement. Emma has a PhD in mixed methods research on youth violence in Colombia and has done a lot of work on evidence-based development. So welcome to all 3 of you. And again, welcome to everyone here in the room and also those of you joining us online. Okay, so let's get started. Leah, I want to start with you. First of all, congratulations on the book. It's a really, really great read. And I was telling Leah earlier, it's an academic book, but it's clear, and this was her intent in writing it, that it's something that practitioners can pick up and do something with. And there's a great set of questions at the back that help people with that. So you focus on the role, the potential, the challenges of consultants in the social impact sector. Tell us, what are the main messages from the book? What do you learn from doing this research, and what should we know about it?
Well, thank you so much. And first of all, thank you so much for having me, my co-panelists, for being part of this discussion. It's a really exciting time. This is the book just came out. It's the first opportunity I've had to speak about it. So I'm excited to hear all of your thoughts and reactions. So I would say the book has a couple of main themes and topics. The first is to paint a more comprehensive and complete picture of the field of consulting to nonprofits. It's much more heterogeneous than many people think and know, much far beyond the household names that might come to mind. And one of the important kind of pieces of this heterogeneity is that consulting firms have different characteristics, specifically larger and smaller firms, work in really different ways in terms of the kind of expertise they claim, the kind of processes they bring to their clients, whether they're corporate clients or third sector nonprofit organizations. So painting that picture is a part of the book. Consultants, as many of us know, are everywhere, right? They're brought in by all kinds of organizations to do lots of different things, whether it's resolving a crisis, planning for the future, or potentially legitimating the ideas of executives or leaders. But I talk about in the book, the type of consultants that an organization might choose to work with can subtly influence the way that their work looks and the conclusions that they might draw for their clients. And I show in the book that, you know, most, certainly not all, but most consultants working in the nonprofit sector have their best clients' interests at heart. They're trying to do their best to help their clients thrive and survive amid challenging circumstances. And because of this, consultants often go in the particular kind of nonprofit sector context, they go to great lengths to customize their work to align what they're doing to the specific characteristics of their clients. However, as they do so, they also reproduce embedded hierarchies and in some ways reinforce the status quo through some of the assumptions that they bring into their work. They do this in a couple of specific ways, and a few that I'll highlight and the main takeaways of the book are that consultants in the course of doing work for their clients often conflate best practices as common practices in the sector. If it's something that's popular among other organizations, they essentially, through the course of their work, come to claim that that's the right way to do things. And they also, in their attempts to build buy-in into their clients' plans and ideas, they often prioritize the opinions of those with power over nonprofit organizations. So think funders, executive staff, important partners over the opinions of lower level staff and community members. And they do this for a variety of reasons, because the insights of powerful folks are often easier and quicker to obtain than that of communities, for example, and because they seem to be more immediately consequential for nonprofits. But in doing so, they essentially reinforce these power relationships in the nonprofit sector. I also show in the book that consultants conflate fundability with feasibility. So they put a very tight linkage between the viability of an idea for an organization, whether it's a good idea for an organization, and whether it's aligned with the idea of a funder. And this simultaneously kind of reinforces funders' power over nonprofits. So as a whole, the book is meant to do a couple of things: paint a more complex view of consulting for nonprofit and third sector organizations, give a closer look into what that work actually looks like, and point out some of the potential unintended consequences.
Okay, fantastic. I have one follow-up question,
Sure.
and I want to get your reaction. So you talked about some of the challenges of sort of reinforcing the power dynamics and drawing on sort of the voices in your particular context of funders. I think there's a really important part that you also talk about in the book that is about sort of the real genuine effort to sort of adapt, customize, understand, and meet the needs of the clients. Tell us a little bit more about that and how you saw that showing up in the work, because it wasn't always easy, right, to do that.
Yeah, so essentially the first part of the book talks about this process of customizing. And I found in many of the consulting organizations in which I had the chance to work that folks who were in a consulting role, oftentimes within a for-profit company, they themselves thought of themselves as social impact-oriented people or nonprofit people. And that kind of drove their intention or their desire to make sure that what they were doing was really meeting the needs of their clients. They did this a couple of different ways. One, I found that consultants often bring conceptual frameworks or kind of theories of organizations essentially into their work with organizations, but instead of just deploying these kind of whole cloth with their clients, they instead were tweaking and customizing or making new frameworks or revising existing frameworks in order to kind of make them fit with their particular clients. And they also use data in a really interesting way. Most consultants did some sort of research in order to inform the work that they were doing with their clients. gathering information about their client organizations, but also about those organizations' peers and stakeholders. But instead of presenting their findings of that research just as reality that organizations should use to make decisions, instead they use data as conversation starters. Essentially, they presented their findings as a way to jumpstart discussion among people in the organizations for which they were working, and then those conversations led where they led. So as opposed to data-driven decision-making, something that we hear about a lot, they instead use data as conversation starters.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So Ben and Emma, let me turn to you. Tell us a little bit about your work. I'll start with you, Ben, and the kinds of organizations you work with, and how the messages that Leah has described from the book, both the sort of positive side of what consultants are doing and some of the challenges that emerge in that work. Does that resonate with what you see from your perspective and with the organizations and ways of working that you're engaging in?
Sure. Thanks for the question, and thanks for coming, and thanks for having me. Great to be in the panel with Leah and Emma. So just an introduction to build on Maria's introduction. I was on the leadership team of our dedicated climate sustainability consulting practice within EY for 4 years. I've come back into the UK to get closer to clients and projects. And I guess maybe the consulting as caregivers really kind of struck a chord, because this was a business when I got involved in it, there was about 1,000 people globally, but quite fragmented. And it's now 4,000 people and really much more at the forefront of what we're trying to do as EY as an organization. Was it the most profitable part of EY? Definitely not. But is it a successful business? Yes. I thought what's a little bit unfair, if I could say, is the fact that, you kind of go, they may overstretch or they might scope creep because they're trying to invest more. I think the blame for that lies in the chronic lack of investment in environmental and social justice at a corporate level as a planet, because the people we deal with are trying to make stuff happen, but with very limited budgets. And often our teams feel compelled to support beyond the budget and the dollars. But also because I think this world is a world of ecosystems and communities, and I think they do feel part of that in a very purposeful way. So I think that's point one. I think the bit that didn't resonate so much was, and I thought there's a little bit of a contradiction, if you don't mind me saying, is feedback that between common practice and best practice, but then customization. You say on the one hand, you conflate common practice with best practice, but then I think there's a language you use that customization kind of holds back knowledge sharing. I think our goal is always to try and push for leadership. And I think, I've got an example of it, if you don't mind, a little bit of indulge me in a little bit of PR as I give examples. But in 2012, we had a team focused on corporate diversity and inclusion. So wanting to help companies in corporate diversity and inclusion. And there was loads of frameworks out, but there was no standard. There was no kind of single standard. And we worked with 20 companies, government-backed, to create what's now called the Global Equality Standard, to try and set a bar. And it was not best, but it wasn't like, let's hoover up common practice and let's say, but it was actually to set quite an aspirational goal. And I think only in that first year, we had like 3 people who actually got anywhere near it. And now 400 organizations go through it, and it's a certification process. So I'd like to think that consultants can do more of that kind of truly best practice. But yes, I think I'll be curious about if you think if you understand my point in the contradiction. And then the other thing just I thought was maybe absent, that is a feature of what we do at EY, is how do we use, so we're 400,000 people globally, enormous monster of an organization. And, we can come on to later questions. I cannot control what 190 country practices do and all of the rest of the teams do around the world, but I can control to some extent what we do, both within our own corporate sustainability reporting team, and what we do as a dedicated practice. And we're, as I said to Marya, we're trying to radicalize from within a little bit. But also our corporate goal is to impact on 1 billion lives by 2030. And we're doing that by donating time, because that's one commodity we have a lot of, is people's time. And since 2016, I think it is, we've donated about 1 million hours of time to NGO and social impact projects. And we give people time to do that. So I guess that might be something you think about, is how does the resources of the consulting industry, how can they be deployed in a positive way?
So I wonder if, I mean, you started off in your comments by talking about how, it's not just one, like, there's different forms of organizing, there's different scales of consulting firms, and you studied a very different scale than Ben is working at. And I wonder if that's part of what's going on. And EY of the world has the position and the resources to mobilize and to set that high bar, to be a leader in getting people on board with that. And that, I'm forgetting your pseudonyms, but the organizations that you study don't have that.
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is that the field of consulting is so heterogeneous that I don't expect people to see all of their practice inside of the book. My hope is for folks to be able to pick up the insights that feel relevant and think with the ones that don't. But I think your comments are fascinating. For example, the piece about scope creep and kind of like overstretching budgets. Many of the consultants that I work with saw that as potentially a good thing. It meant that they were living their values.
Right.
Right. And so I think
that resonates.
From a business perspective, it could be seen as a bad thing. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that the reason for this ultimately is the financial structure of third sector organizations and the fact that everybody's working with less than they need, essentially. But it really depended on where someone was situated within a consulting organization, what their opinion was about the fact that they invested more in the projects than perhaps they were receiving in fees. The contradiction piece I also think is interesting and totally fair. It's something that I grappled with in writing the book, that consultants did do a lot of customizing, but they oftentimes were pulling on in comparing their client organizations to their peers, were essentially oftentimes, because these smaller consulting firms were also limited in the time that they had to do this research, they were essentially looking for publicly available information about peer organizations and using that information to inform what their clients should do. And so even as they were tweaking their own processes to accommodate the specifics of their organizations, when they were looking for examples about what other organizations in the field were doing, oftentimes they would essentially be defaulting to the average practice or the common practice. And the piece about like, can consulting firms generate best practices? They absolutely can. And I think especially larger consulting firms you're right, I did much, that wasn't the kind of focus of the research in the book. I did interact with those organizations to some extent. Many smaller consulting firms kind of exported insights that were produced by global larger firms and then applied them to their own practices. So I think it, again, kind of depends where in the field you're situated. And then the other interesting piece is, for these larger consulting firms that are doing a lot of what they call thought leadership or kind of producing frameworks for consumption by others in the field, what kind of research those insights are based on. I remember very specifically, I was doing some observation at a larger consulting firm. They only allowed me in for one day, and so I really had to make it count. And I was sitting in a meeting of consultants from this larger firm that were talking about producing some sort of knowledge for the sector about, I can't remember exactly what it was about, but they essentially were directing the lower level staff to comb through all of the client cases that they had had over the past several years and use that to come up with a theory. And I was a sociologist, and I was like, you're not going to look at, like, there's a lot of sociological literature on this topic as well. And I couldn't say that, of course, so I was observing, but there was no talk of consulting other sources of knowledge essentially on this topic. And it was so interesting to me, not necessarily that it's a bad thing, just a really different definition of what research is and how to generate information. Yeah.
Okay, Emma, I want to hear from you. How do the messages from the book resonate with the work that you do? And I guess perhaps start by telling us a little bit about the kinds of organizations you work with.
Sure, thank you so much. And let me echo the general thanks to the Institute and Leah and others. So I work for a small, medium-sized company. We're about 65 people, so probably more typical of the kind of organizations and consultancies you've described in your book. We work in the international development sector, used to be known as the aid sector. And we have a core focus on gender equality and social inclusion. So we focus quite a lot on the substance, if you will, not quite as much on processes. And yeah, so fascinated and really welcome the chance for this sort of self-reflexivity and questioning what we do and how we do that. I feel like that's a really important part of learning and improving what we do. And I definitely, you know, some of the messages in your book definitely resonated around customization, some of the questions around kind of power and positionality. In the sector that I work in, the kind of major story, I guess, of the last 10 years has been around a shift towards locally led practice and really questioning the role of international organizations and the power and decision making and resources that they have versus local organizations in the countries where we're working. Nevertheless, I guess, you know, some areas, I think a bit like Ben, there would be some areas that I would kind of question. It didn't feel particularly true, not just of, you know, the organization that I work for, but I would say of many of those in the sector. So there's this piece around the use of data that you touched on here, and I think you describe it as smell checking data. So bringing data and evidence to the client. We work, by the way, mostly for UK government, UN agencies, international financial institutions, not so much the not-for-profits. So of course, those power dynamics actually look very, very different when you're talking about, you know, the UK government as opposed to a small grassroots organization, etc. But anyway, one of the things I really enjoy about working for a consultancy, and I have had a background in advocacy and in the civil society sector. But one of the things I really enjoy about working for a consultancy is the ability to bring evidence to the table and not have a big campaign agenda or advocacy agenda. It feels a little bit more kind of straightforward. And when you're meeting with your client, you're not trying to kind of push an agenda. So on the smell checking data, I think is your terminology. I would say that it is about presenting data, but recognizing that there are all sorts of other data points from the lived experience of the staff, the client, you know, the client largely. So it is a conversation, and that to me is a very good thing. It enables a conversation, and that in turn enables uptake. You know, we've seen so many examples of research that then just sits on the shelf because it's not used, it's not practical, it doesn't resonate with your client. It can't be used. And it's also about recognizing that that client, whoever they be, whether it's the UK government or a not-for-profit organization, is not existing in isolation, but part of a complex, you know, landscape or ecology of other organizations. So you're kind of pulling on more of what I guess what we would refer to as a political economy analysis, understanding the tasks that you've been given within that wider landscape, and therefore making it useful. So I feel that's kind of quite an important bit. So in a way, I would be quite proud to say, yes, we use data to start a conversation with a client because we know that that is what's going to actually make it useful. And I guess as consultants, beyond, you know, delivering, you really do want to have for that work to be impactful in whatever way, in persuading or dissuading or whatever, but that is for the client. If I may, maybe one other point that I would pick up here is around, you know, who's setting the scope of work. So again, in the book, you talk a bit about reinforcing these sort of hierarchies of power, and you're talking to the senior leadership of an organization, and it's and you're kind of presenting funders and the kind of those in power. You're presenting those viewpoints alongside the evidence. So I guess my counter to that would be, and again, my organization is working on issues around gender and inclusion, so it does very specifically have a mandate to challenge that status quo. But you know, in some of the work that we've done, we've tried to innovate and work very differently with organizations. I've got colleagues in Malawi who have been working on gender-based violence programs with local women's rights organizations. who are now front and center of those programs, no longer us as an international organization, but rather sort of changing and disrupting, if you will. Now we've had the buy-in of our partners, clients in the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, which is the, part of the UK government that funds this programming. So we brought them with us on this journey together, but it is changing a bit that status quo of international organizations absorbing the power and the money.
Okay, I think we've just had a very good example of what you're talking about. You try to do with your clients with data, which is, it started a conversation. And you guys didn't agree with all the data that was presented, in part because it came from a different context. Right. And now we think about boundary conditions and generalizability. And I mean, in the book, you're very careful, right? To say like, this is what I studied. This is one piece of a broader industry. It's heterogeneous. I focus here, right? And we can see it is heterogeneous, right? And there's sort of a substantive focus, there's a scale issue, and all of that comes into the mix. So I just want to thank you for starting this conversation.
Absolutely.
So I want to pick up on something that I think is an important theme in the book, and it's really an important theme for us at the Skoll Centre, which is in the book, the role of consultants in driving change is certainly front and center, and something that it seems to me the people you studied really care about. At the Skoll Centre, we think about 4 core processes of systemic change: leading and organizing, financing, measuring, and scaling. And I would welcome thoughts, maybe starting with you, Leah, on how consultants can play a role in one or more of these processes. I mean, recognizing you focused on really the sort of strategy consulting aspect, right? And thinking about, well, okay, we're trying to drive change in the world, but we have to build a business, whether it's a nonprofit consulting, a for-profit, we have to survive as an organization at some level. And so how can consultants, or how do you see consultants balancing those or not balancing them?
Definitely. So I want to start my response by responding to a couple of things
Yes,
that Emma
absolutely.
said, which I think are really well taken. First of all, I don't actually think that this way of using data is a bad thing at all. I actually, it's my preferred way of working with data as well, despite being a very different way of doing research than my sociological training might suggest. I think that it's the consultants that I studied said exactly the same thing that you did. This is how we make data actionable, or else it gets essentially rejected. It sits on a shelf. And so I think rather than saying it's a good or a bad practice, it's more, I think, important to point out the ways in which the kinds of research and the ways that consultants work with data is distinct from other research traditions. Because I do think that sometimes, and there were some good examples of that in my research, when client organizations or nonprofits or government agencies come in with a different expectation around what research might look like or how it might be brought to bear on their problems or questions, they can end up dissatisfied. And so I think it's just important in pointing out that this is intentional, right? It's a specific way of working with information that is part of the relational nature of the consulting process, right? And the relational nature of change. So I think that's speaking to kind of how consultants bring about change. I think that the kind of micro relational aspect that, we're talking about these large problems, whether they're organizational, whether they're societal, whether they're global, but in solving them, we're working with people. Right. And so I think that is a major way in which consultants contribute to change, is by paying attention to those interpersonal and organizational dynamics, if that makes sense. And then the other piece around the way that you all are kind of trying to work to change the status quo and working intentionally with communities on the ground, I think that's wonderful. And the point that I would raise from that is that it takes moving with intentionality in order to do so. Right, that you need to really pay attention to exactly how it is you're gathering data, with whom, how you're balancing these perspectives in order to avoid kind of perpetuating the perspectives of the powerful. So I really appreciate, that you all are doing that work. And then to respond kind of more broadly to this question about consultants and change, my answer to that question is more one of what are we changing to, rather than whether and how consultants bring about change, because I think that's oftentimes they're in the business of change, right? And in sociological theory and a lot of kind of popular perception of consultants and firms working in the nonprofit sector and beyond, is this kind of dominant notion that consultants and firms are carriers or messengers of ideas from the business world, bringing them into either other firms, other sectors, civil society organizations, contributing in the nonprofit sector to the businessification of nonprofits. And essentially what I found in the book was something somewhat distinct, that in many cases, the consultants that I studied were in fact working to make nonprofits more like nonprofits, as opposed to making them more like businesses or making them more like other kinds of organizations. And they were doing that partially because many of them came from careers in the nonprofit or the public sector, and also because they believed very strongly that nonprofits were special and that mission-oriented organizations were special, and they themselves wanted to contribute to that mandate. So that's kind of what I would say, is that it's not a question of if they're contributing to change, but what kind of change or what difference.
Okay, Ben, I want to turn to you. Before we started the seminar, we were chatting, and you were talking a little bit about the efforts now with the CCAS practice within EY to really push towards, in your engagements with clients and for the firm overall, to push towards more systemic approaches to change. And that's not easy, right? It's hard for all of us to do that. And it's, I think, especially hard in sort of dyadic client relationships. So talk a little bit about how you guys are thinking about that, and you know, maybe there aren't competing demands between pushing for that and trying to build a viable practice, but I imagine there might be.
There could be. I mean, a lot of the work we do globally is point to point, what you might call it. So working with one individual company or organization on the foundational things they need to do, build a strategy, baseline where they are, think about where others are, you know, build a roadmap, all those kind of things. But I think systemic change is where we want to take it for two reasons. One is because by any measure, choose your stat. So SDGs not delivered. You know, we have more slaves in the world than we ever did before. Emissions heading to 3 degrees, 2100. You know, the world is, we are not doing enough, and corporates need to do more. But I guess to the point of common practice versus best practice, and one of the things I'm really mindful of is what's the premium in leadership. So an organization steps forward beyond the pack. Are they rewarded for that, or are they punished for that? Now, in the corporate world, generally, there's lots of examples of where companies have had purposeful leaders take a step forward, and it's not worked out. And it might be actually bad strategy, but many often cases it's because the capital markets are too short term, and they're not rewarding long-term value creation from that. So that's kind of the main reason I think systemic change is needed, because companies are going to reach the limits of what they can do alone before they hit that wall. And we're seeing that. Our data, we did a survey last year, it's called the Sustainable Value Study, and it showed corporate sustainability targets have slipped 14 years in 1 year backwards. And we're really in it, you know, so 2019, 2020, there was lots of enthusiasm, Glasgow Summit, you know, Glasgow call, loads of commitments. Most organizations had no idea how they're going to meet the targets, and now they are realizing it's hard. And it's hard to do it alone. Decarbonization, supply chain transformation, social impact, social transformation, it's hard. So I think the only answer then is systemic level change, partly to help the sectors move in unison, but also to help them understand the dependencies and collaboration opportunities, whether it's with advocacy, with policy, or teaming up on a specific part of the system. Another little plug, last week, we launched a report for the Institute of Grocery Distribution, working with WRAP, the NGO, environmental NGO WRAP. And it was about food system transition in the UK. And there's loads of great data in 150 pages of report. But just one simple example is the number of half-empty trucks driving up and down the country. All right. I mean, it's a really simple problem you'd think to solve systemically, but they're not doing it. So why are they not doing it? And there's a cost benefit to it. So I would say, I'll wrap it up by saying our goal is to do much more of that system level change, partly because I think it's needed, but partly also because we have an amazing opportunity as a huge organization to make that happen between policy, government, technology, finance, and corporate.
Okay, thank you. Emma, anything you want to add on to how we think about the role and the role of your work and your firm in systems change, systemic change?
Yeah, and it's so different for us because we're a tiny little organization, 65 people, what do you say, 400,000?
Only 400,000.
Yeah. So the odds are stacked slightly in your favor. That said, we have a very niche focus. And when you have an organization that is, focusing on a very specific agenda, I mean, not a tiny agenda, don't get me wrong, gender equality, social inclusion, but it is what we do in all the work that we do. So you can then, develop something of a reputation as being a go-to organization in those areas of expertise. I would say what we've learned on that is working across alliances and looking for, partners and thought leaders and others, and working together to push an agenda forward. So you're not trying to do it alone, trying to do it as part of a wider movement. And that has been fundamental to success. And, working with the leaders in organizations to look at incentives within those organizations. So a good example of that is when we work with what was DFID, the Department for International Development, now part of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. How do you begin to make changes on gender equality across the whole organization, and people that have never thought about this issue before? They might be specialists in area, they might be generalists, but this isn't their kind of area of expertise. You build it into their incentives, you build it into their performance management system, and you put a bonus at the end of the line if they're getting it right. You're just kind of looking to make systemic change through those kind of adjustments. I guess it's not wildly dissimilar to kind of nudge theory and that story. So maybe that on the one side, and persistence, isn't it? It's just looking at the long term, and not setting yourself targets that are achievable and realistic.
So, I mean, I think you started by sort of saying, well, we're a small organization, and we can't do this great. But those are systems that you're changing, right, inside each of those units and organizations, right? Systems are at many scales. Okay, I want to get into one final set of questions, and then we'll open it up a bit. Clients. So to hear you talk, I might have thought the client was the planet. But of course, the client is also the client who pays the bills, right? So how do consultants think about the client and balance the sort of immediate client and the broader client? And how did this come up in your work?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and of course, this is one of the primary questions in consulting. And to reframe it slightly, one of the kind of provocations that I make in the book is this idea that consultants can be reproducing the status quo in their attempts to help their clients manage within their existing circumstances. So saying, if your client is the organization sitting in front of you, and what you're trying to do is help make sure that they're going to be sustainable for the next 5 years, your incentive is to work within existing power structures in order to help them do that. As opposed to, for example, trying to change a paradigm more broadly because your client is the planet or society writ large. And I mentioned this as we were talking earlier today, that I think that we need some of both, right? We need some folks who are working to take care of organizations and the people that they serve, while other organizations are working to challenge the status quo and to actually move society forward in a meaningful way. But what I argue in the book, and this is one of my key kind of offerings to the field, is we have to make that choice intentionally. Are we one or are we the other? And I think especially in recent years, many consulting firms, at least in the United States, have really come out strongly saying, we're about social change. Like, what we want to be doing is promoting anti-racism, equity, change to kind of undo or challenge these pernicious inequities and power dynamics that many of us are beholden to. But the reality is that they're actually doing the former, right? They're actually trying to help their clients manage. And I think it's easy to conflate one with the other, but what we really need to do in order to get to these larger social change goals that we have is to intentionally choose. Are we taking care of people in the meantime, or are we trying to change systems and structures? And I think there's room for both, but it takes an intentional choice and some real reflection on practice.
Okay. Ben or Emma, how do you think about this in your organization?
Yeah, I mean, we have an organizational vision and mission and set of values. And that, to some extent, will determine the clients that we take on and work with. So, you know, when we're screening opportunities, because we are demand driven, you know, we're responding to the market. We will pick those opportunities where we believe that there is a contribution to be made to social justice, etc. And therefore, largely, you know, we wouldn't tend to have a client with wildly dissimilar kind of vision of where it wants to go to. So that kind of helps ensure that there is a certain level of alignment. But you can also take your client with you and encourage them to go on a journey where they might do something a little bit more, I don't know, progressive, perhaps than they had considered. So you might make a suggestion around, well, you know, why don't we do an all-staff survey to see how everybody in this organization is feeling about safeguarding and whether they feel that they, you know, are sufficiently protected from sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment in the workplace or whatever it might be. So I mean, you talk about the planet, I guess we're talking about the wider society and social good and social justice. You know, largely the contracts that we take on are sort of aligned with that anyway. So I don't think that we see it in perhaps such a sort of binary way. The two, there is an overlap, that Venn diagram between those two core constituents.
Yeah. Well, this is definitely an area of interest for me. And we actually put a report out a couple of years ago that was as a critique of the corporate sustainability world, and basically looked at over 20 years, the rise of the number of companies that have signed up and organizations signed up to the UN Global Compact and CDP as a, you know, carbon disclosure project and various other amazing things that they've signed up to. Yet, by all other metrics in the planet, things haven't got better. So it's a bit like, okay, so what are we doing? And are we actually perpetuating what we've called in the paper incrementalism? It's just, we'll be a little bit better next year. We'll be a little less polluting, and we'll be a little bit more equitable, and we'll use less fresh water from local communities. But actually, what should you have used, and what level of equity should you have, and what level of carbon budget should you have? And that psyche doesn't really exist. And it's a provocation back into our world. And there's a lot of appetite to make that change. But if we were just to go in with that to every pitch, we would get thrown out of every pitch. There's a level of pragmatism. Get in the door. Often it's like regulatory driven. There's loads of, as I'm sure you know, sustainability regulation coming mostly from Europe, but also globally. And many of those guys are like, I've just got to get compliance done. But honestly, if in 10 years time, I look back on the legacy of the team that we've done, and all we've done is generate more Word documents. Like, is that our, like, more words in the report, annual report? I think that would be quite depressing. So I think there's an obligation, and I accept the size and scale thing, but with that, I think there is an obligation on organizations of our scale to actually speak about this and acknowledge the risks of incrementalism and exacerbating a bad business as usual and provoking for something different. But, you know, with that, we've got to be commercial and we've got to find our way in.
Okay, well, I think many people in this room are students in various ways and actually want to join you on this journey. And so I just want to ask one last question, which is, for those in the room who are thinking about building a career or moving ahead with their career in this space of consulting in the impact sector, leave us with one key point or takeaway for them to consider.
Give me time to think.
So I was reflecting a bit on this question of, trying to make this short, but this question of sort of where power lies, and, you know, decision making and policy makers on the one side, and funders who are, you know, holding the purse strings on the other, and practitioners. So, you know, Ben and I in this forum are considered practitioners, but in most other forums, I don't think we would be described as practitioners. I think working in consultancy provides an incredibly interesting opportunity to influence and to be a catalyst. It isn't necessarily about making decisions, but it's about combining, you know, the evidence piece with the decision makers, with the folks who are practitioners in whatever that field is, and kind of being at the center of that. So there's something there around coordination and catalyzing a conversation which is enormously exciting and yeah, very satisfactory work in my mind.
Yeah. Well,
Do you want to go?
can I do? Well, I would echo that. I mean, I feel very fortunate to have a career in this space, and feel like I can make a difference, which is a wonderful place to be. It can be a bit frustrating at times, and I guess my advice is something around like be human, and I'll maybe in two contexts. One is the be human bit, which is to be values led and purposeful, and acknowledge that there will be times in your career that you're just feeling like you're swimming against the tide or working against the system or whatever, but actually keep the faith, because you know your values and your purpose will transcend where you work, and it's important that you bring that to work. And then the other thing is recognizing, we had a bit of this chat before, is you know companies are made up of people supposedly to serve society. Doesn't always feel like that, but they should have a societal function. And I think the key thing is you know, in a way I wish I was a sociologist or a psychologist sometimes, because the key role, a key superpower for a consultant, I think, is to inspire and motivate others, particularly in this space. So you've got to give a vision of hope. And that's an incredibly privileged place to be when you're working with an organization, a company, or NGO, where you can genuinely feel like you're inspiring them, motivating them to do something quite radical.
That's great. And I will just say, you know, my colleagues here are great examples. There are a lot of options when it comes to a career in consulting. And so I would say, like, if you are approaching consulting as your way of making the change in the world that you want to make, think also about how it is that you want to do that. Are you interested more in metrics or financial modeling? Are you interested more in conversations with other people? The field is so heterogeneous, and you might land in a place that actually has slightly different methods or slightly different values based in those methods than you have. So I think not only about the what, but about the how.
Okay, thank you. We're going to open it up to questions. Those of you here in the room, just please put your hand up, and anyone online, please just type into the chat. Yeah. Hold on. Do we need the mic? Yeah. Okay. This will enable those joining online to hear you.
Thank you. Thank you all of us for your time here on Friday. My question is for Ben. You mentioned that you donated 1,000 hours to NGO and social projects. And then you follow up saying that because one thing that consultants have is time. And this shocked me a bit, because when I used to be a consultant, the only thing that I didn't have was time. So I want to know how you manage let's say that billable hours with this donation into projects. So do you treat it as an individual project? Do you treat it as part-time, in which you then take the time elsewhere, let's say, or how do you manage both?
Yeah, I understand the question, and it is a global program called Ripples, and it's online. People can go on the intranet and see lots of NGOs and social projects they can work with, and they sign up to it. And then there's a level of peer pressure put on their leaders to give their time. So normally it's a secondment, so they're actually taken out of the business and given to the NGO or social impact project for a period of time. So they don't then have how do I fit this around busy weeks and all the rest of it? And it's 1 million hours, by the way, not 1,000 hours. It isn't not been that impressive. But yes, it's always a dilemma. You know, we run the business, a very simple business model, right? It's people times hours times price equals revenue. So there's always that pressure. But I think when you've got a global, you know, it's a global construct that is one of our biggest missions. And it's kind of, you create a bit of a religion about it, if that makes sense. Like a bit of it's a Ripples project. Okay, it's a Ripples project, rather than just something done off the side of the desk. It's a hobby project for someone locally. So it's been given scale, it's strategic, signed off by the global CEO. So you top down, it's got all the right conditions for success. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to pose 4 questions from online, and you can decide which ones you respond to. Okay, so the first one is, for those getting started in consulting, do you need to be good at networking? How do you get started? The second one is, any role models for people working as consultants in the social impact space? Anyone's work, maybe from outside of your organizations, you want to highlight? A question for Ben in particular, what do you think of degrowth in this work, and how do you think about that with clients? And a final question, I mean, we're in an ivory tower here. How do you guys engage with academic research? And for the researchers in the room, how can they get involved and how can they make their work useful too?
Okay. Do you want to start with role models? Exemplars?
Not really.
No. Well, in my world, purposeful leaders who stuck their neck out, I would say, are role models for us and me. You had Paul Pullman at your breakfast. I think he is very good at what he does. I love also Jonathan Porritt in the UK. He's incredible because he's just been so brave and courageous and in kind of working within the system, but also being quite critical of it. So if you saw his commentary about Unilever, for example, if you haven't tuned in already, it's really interesting kind of critique because he advised the Paul Pullman era for many, many years. And then as the new administration has felt the need to refocus and rebalance what they've done, he's got quite a critique of it. So he manages to create that balance. He's a radical. He's founded the Green Movement in the UK, but he actually is fully accepted by the corporate world. I think he's somehow done a remarkable job.
We were talking earlier and I mentioned a book that I used to assign when I taught a class on social entrepreneurship, and it's called Tempered Radicals, which is exactly what you're describing.
And also just to answer the networking question, I think, yes, you do need to be good at working with other people. I think, as I mentioned earlier, in conversation with Emma, consulting is fundamentally a relational process. And change can't happen unless you've been able to form a strong and trusting relationship with other people. During the research, a consultant in a larger firm pointed out that in addition to IQ, you need EQ or emotional something. I can't remember what the acronym exactly is, but the point being that you really need to be able to work productively with people to understand, especially in the social sector, the kind of multiple motivations for the work between financial sustainability and mission. And I think that it's one of the foundational qualities, I think, of successful consulting work in my experience.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that. And I'd also add that I know lots of great consultants, and there are just as many, I guess, sort of introverted personalities as there are extroverted personalities. So I agree with what you've said about networking, but I'd add the caveat that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're kind of, thrusting into every conversation and working the room, because you can build those relationships and engage those networks, with integrity and build that reputation, whatever your personality type. And I think there's sometimes an assumption that, you've got to be the loudest person in the room. I don't think that's true.
Absolutely. And I make in the book, a kind of distinction between what I call unexpected advice and collective wisdom. That these are two different ways of working in consulting, the former being kind of bringing knowledge or information that's seen as novel or a break from what organizations are used to hearing into the room, versus collective wisdom being kind of facilitating, a skill in facilitating conversations and in bubbling up insights from an existing group of people. And I think those kind of facilitation skills, or the ability to help people talk to one another, are just as important in successful consulting relationships as having, the big idea or being, having the loudest voice in the room.
Okay, we're 1 minute over, but I want to let Ben respond on degrowth.
Oh my
I think
goodness.
you have something important to say.
It's either my daughter is studying economics at university, or it's a lawyer at EYHQ that's asked that question. I'm trying to figure out which. We actually just put a report out. We've got a research group that we created in our climate and sustainability practice called the New Economy Unit. And we don't talk about degrowth, but we do point out the challenges of overconsumption, linear economy, growth at all costs, and frame, corporate sustainability can only do so much in an unsustainable economic model. And I think we would all recognize that to be true. I'm not going around EY towers talking about degrowth, put it that way, but we are creating a narrative that points out the challenges of coupling growth with material. And that's our fundamental challenge. So the paradigm needs to change. It's not going to be easy, but we're trying to get more people on board.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. We'll take one more question. Yes. Yes.
So I just wanted to ask Leah about the challenge of when should consultants be used by nonprofits? So descriptively, what triggers the decision? I think that's a useful starting point. Then I'd like to know what you've learned at the end of all the research about when should a nonprofit turn to consultants? What is the decision rule that you have come to at this point? And then for the two practitioners, what have you done? I'm just curious to kind of help build capacity within the clients that you work with so that they can actually carry out the work that you've done for them on their own, so that they're not left in a perpetual cycle of need, that they build internal capacity. Is that something that you consider when you do a project? And if so, how do you do it? So those would be my two questions, but we're there.
Oh, sure. So yeah, these are great questions. I think that organizations turn to consultants for a variety of reasons, oftentimes because they're stuck in some fashion, whether they are stuck in terms of they have a problem that they need to solve. You know, their balance sheet isn't balancing, whether they have a question about the future. How do we have two options, which one do we choose? Or perhaps they're stuck in the sense that the board and the executive director don't see eye to eye. And the executive director wants to take the organization in one direction, the board wants to take it in another direction. So in those cases, consultants can be brought in either to really try to problem solve or to try to be asked to rubber stamp an idea that already exists. The latter being a more problematic proposition, and a lot of times where consultants and organizations end up getting into situations where they end up dissatisfied with what they have received. I think in the best case scenario, organizations should turn to external advice when they're really open to asking hard questions and going in a different direction. I think that some of the most frustrating examples of consulting engagements come when an organization paints themselves as interested in a solution to their consultant partners, but once the consultant's actually inside of the organization, they actually have a huge roadblock to doing anything with that information. And that doesn't serve the organization or its resources, and it also doesn't serve the consultant. So I think there has to be an openness, and I would say an interest in transparency on both sides. I think it's really important that consultants are transparent with their clients about what they do and don't know, where the strength of their network and expertise is and where it isn't. Because as we all know, third sector organizations have constrained resources, and it's really important that they are able to use them in ways that are productive for themselves and the communities they serve.
My question, I think, is mostly for Ben, but if anyone feels they can take it, take it. So I was just thinking how private-public partnerships tend to be used to sort of stimulate economies, especially in the global south. So I was curious, does EY work on private partnerships? And if so, does it fall more into the financing interest or ESG frameworks? And if so, how then does sort of the companies that are sort of consulting on these private-public partnerships, how do they ascribe the value? Is it a financial imperative or is it an ESG imperative? And how easy is it to sort of encourage them to then use sustainable supply chains?
Okay,
Yeah.
Great question. Couple of examples I can think of. So I think where we tend to operate is more at the kind of institutional level. So for example, with the multilateral banks, working with private banks to try and help mobilize finance for specific projects, which will then get distributed through funds. So we work with government agencies to also help administer and manage and assure a lot of the global funds that come out. But oftentimes there is a multilateral bank and a finance bank there. So European Climate Foundation, for example, we've worked with them, with the European Central Bank to help mobilize money around green transition projects. But we tend to work on the program level of that. It's harder for us to work at the kind of, the end of I think that's where a lot of the local organizations really come into their own. And I think a few of you are working in agriculture, regenerative agriculture. That's an area that increasingly we're being pulled into, largely often by our kind of European or West, American banks who are finding it expensive and too risky to support smallholders, but actually want to. But how do you de-risk it and how do you reduce the cost of every transaction? And they're looking for organizations that can somehow create, again, a program so they can invest in a program once, and then an organization like ours runs the operations and runs the kind of risk and fund aspect of it. Thank you for your question.
Okay.
I don't know if you've got any other.
I wanted to answer the other question, which was about, I think was an online question about what's the role of academics. I think it's an incredibly important role. We love working with universities and academic colleagues, and the scientific rigor that they can bring to the evidence gathering, and increasingly in the sector we see lots and lots of these huge applied research funds. There's one on violence against women and children. I think it was the original grant, the original program was worth £25 million, and it's all over the world, very sort of implementing different projects and really being stringent in the measurement of what actually works. And I think that's the kind of area where academics bring something really important to the table. So I think it's huge, and we work very happily with all kinds of universities, both in the UK, but also across the global south. So I just wanted to make sure to answer that.
Thank you. And thank you all. We've gone over. So we're going to stop. I want to thank Leah, Emma, and Ben for a really wonderful conversation. And again, to thank Peter and the Gradel Institute for Charity for co-hosting this seminar with us. Thank you so much. Those of you who are here in Oxford, please join us in the reception afterwards, right here in this room. And all of you will have the seminar series starting up again next term. This is our last one for this term. January 24th will be the next seminar, and we hope to see you then. Thank you so much.
Thanks.